Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Church at Home with Rachel for Wednesday, the 30th of October. Hope you're all doing well. It's getting cold and frosty here, and for those of you who live where I live, we turn our clocks back next on Saturday, so we get an extra hour of sleep, and we'll wake up with the light, and we'll go home from work in the dark. I know lots of people don't like the changing of the time, but I don't mind it. I always enjoy the extra hour in the morning, the light in the morning for a little bit longer. And I really do enjoy the evenings. It reminds me to go home at the end of the day and just cuddle up with a good book or a movie and sit on the couch with my blanket and hang out with my husband. A week from today, though, I will be in England. And I will have an interesting perspective because I will be a Canadian in England as the world watches the results of the American election. And quite possibly, it will take several days or weeks before the election is actually figured out. We all acknowledge that, I think. However, it will be interesting to see what's happening from a place that isn't close to them when the results come in. Yesterday, a bunch of us after a meeting went out for lunch, and in part of the conversation came up the fact that other politicians around the world are actually coming up with strategies around publicly coming up with strategies around what happens if who wins in the States. And we would have to be naive to believe that any country wouldn't have a plan A, plan B scenario, depending on who wins a federal or a national election. Because, of course, who wins the election changes the way the politics will be done, changes the policies and the relationships between countries and trade, and things like the UN and NATO and all kinds of things like that. And so, of course, every good politician and their cabinet or however they're set up will indeed have those war plans. How are we going to deal with X, Y, Z? That's just a normal thing. But when they're talking about it publicly, that becomes, to me, that's a bellwether. It's when we realize just how seriously we need to take something. The other day, as I was driving home from the airport on Sunday evening, I had the radio on, and I hadn't listened to any news for a full week. It had been literally a week since I'd had the news on. And I was listening, and the radio stations, I wanted to catch up on the news, and it was carrying one of the candidates' speech from Madison Square Gardens, which was, as many have been mentioning, it was hearkening back to a similar speech given in the 1930s at Madison Square Gardens, which was a warning to the world at that time about what could happen. And this particular speech and the speakers who went before the candidate also was a warning to the world about what could happen. This morning, as I was driving into work, I was listening, and the commentators on my radio station, sorry, I need my coffee here, my throat's got a tickle in it. The commentators on this station I was listening to were talking about one of the people who was part of the program at the rally at Madison Square Gardens, who a very popular newscaster himself in his day, who got up and talked about the candidate as being an angry daddy who is angry with his little girls, and they deserve a vigorous spanking. And something to the effect that he would like that, he would enjoy that the girls, terrifies me to hear people talking about that, because if it's being spoken about in probably the most powerful or second or third most powerful country in the world by now, that publicly and in that way, how long will it take the rest of the world to go that way? There have been other incidents of women who have had women's health care issues removed from them. One woman who had to carry a child that she knew was being born with a particular syndrome, and right after the baby was born, he died in her arms. Another woman, because she was denied health care, gave birth to a child who was not viable and is now sterile and can never have children. And another woman who they were referring to having to prove how much she was bleeding out in her pregnancy before she could get the health care she needed. That is inhumane. It wasn't very many years ago that I remember, maybe it was a few because I was still in school, I think, but I remember people being up in arms, women in particular being up in arms about a female genitalia mutilation in certain places in the world and how wrong that was. About child brides and women, young girls being forced to marry men 3-4 times their ages and to become one of many women, children, who were forced to be impregnated because they were raped. No 12-year-old girl should be married to someone else. And when you're married for 12 years old, there's pretty much only one reason why. We used to get up in arms about those things. We used to think about women and want to protect them. I don't have any daughters, but I have nieces. And the idea that healthcare in one of the largest and most progressive countries in the world has gone to the place where if my nieces lived in that country, they would have to second guess whether or not they could get the health care they needed. That they would have to humiliate themselves to ask for that health care in the first place and allow other people to ask questions they had no right to ask, to make them feel like their health care was somehow second best or secondary to someone else's decision. Not to mention the doctors and nurses and healthcare providers whose hands are tied because they're scared about going to prison. Some people might argue that those healthcare providers who are scared of going to prison are they're wusses. They're just weaklings. They're not willing to take it on. But think about it this way. If you're a doctor, male or female, and you are being told if you do an abortion or you have someone come into the emergency room in your hospital who is self-aborting, who's having a miscarriage, and you help them through that in a healthy way so that they can still have children and that they don't lose their life due to blood loss or other complications. The fact that you could be charged and put in jail, lose your license, unable to take care of your own family, things like that, but also put in jail. If those things happen, then that takes you out of the roster of people who can help people coming into the emergency room, regardless of what they're there for. I don't know about that particular country we're talking about, but I know that in Canada we have a healthcare crisis. We don't have enough healthcare individuals, providers. We're running low on doctors everywhere. We can't get enough nurse practitioners. Hospitals are always scarce of what they need. So to think of a world in which that's the case, that regardless of legal things, healthcare is hard to come by, add in things like no insurance, which limits the number of people who can even feel comfortable going to seek health care, and then say, well, we're going to penalize doctors for doing what they're trained to do for the good of the patient, scare them into the bejeebers out of them so they won't do it, or if they do it, pull them right out of the ability to do it and put them in jail. How is that helping the country? How is it helping people? How is it helping women? There have been statements made in Canada over the years. We're getting better, our politicians are getting better about hiding them, but there have been statements made, including one by a former leader of one of the parties, who talked about the traditional family and the role of women, because he was raised by a mom who stayed home to raise her children while dad went out to work, because that's the way a family should be, indicating that that's the way Canadian families should be. The dad goes to work, the mom stays home, women know their place. There has work been done with former Canadian politicians working with American institutions that actually talk about the role of women, and they haven't been flattering. I am terrified of what will happen with this election. Two things could happen. They're extremes. One is that if a woman is elected, whole generations of women after her, young women coming up, those young women who are brand new voters, those young women who are only 17 and can't vote yet, will look at her and say, the world is my oyster, I can do anything. If we can elect a female president, if we can make change for women through proper means like voting and lobbying legislation or legislators and working together to change the world, then the world is wonderful. We can do this. Not because we want to do something different than men, but because together, men and women, all created beings, can work together to make good things happen. That's on one side, and that's what Obviously, if you've listened to me before, you know that's what I'm hoping for. Not because I want a woman president in the United States, but because I want humanity to be treated with integrity and dignity. All people, Puerto Ricans, people of indigenous people, people of color, people who are brown or black or white, people who are immigrants, people who are Muslims, people who are Christians, people who are atheists. I would like everyone in every country of the world to be treated as if they are like everyone else. I believe that we are all created in God's image, so we don't have the right to treat someone else as if they aren't, regardless of what they believe or not. On the other hand, what might we have? And I say we because this election will impact the world. This election will have ramifications everywhere. Financially, on the economy, will have massive implications, which will impact each of us. The cost of bread, the cost of milk. We had a jug of milk that went bad right after we opened it, and I was pouring it down the drain and feeling bad because that jug of milk cost us over $7. And that's just in Brandon. In the north, a jug of milk can cost well over $20. What will happen to our economy if the world sees that one of the largest powers is going into a schmozzle? What will happen to companies in Canada who ship parts to be used in cars and other things that are made in America if tariffs continue to go up? If it becomes a competition about egos rather than what's good for the universal economy? What's going to happen to the relationships we have in simple things like hockey or baseball or traveling and tourism? What's going to happen in the world if a leader is elected who stands by and lets Putin do what Putin wants to do? A leader who would deport people who are people just because. A leader who is touted as being an angry daddy who wants to spank the bad girls. You choose who the bad girls are. Is it his opposition? Is it the people who have spoken up against him, the Liz Cheneys? Is it the people who have quietly worked to not have him back in office? It's a scary thought. The world needs our prayers. We who aren't in the United States can do nothing to change the outcome of that election, but we can pray. We can pray that God's will be done. And if by some chance Old Scratch gets in there and that doesn't happen, we can pray that cooler heads will prevail, that people will be calm, the people who are upset about the election and the results will recognize that there is no point in pointing fingers, being angry, causing riots, but that together they have to work toward the good of their country. Because in the long run, we really are just a big village. What happens south of us affects us too, and it does change our own politics. May we pray, all of you from all over, because I know I have viewers from many places around the world. Let's take the next week to pray for the people involved in all of the elections in the United States, for their families and for their loved ones, for all the people who will vote, who will have the courage to get out and vote, the people who are working hard to make sure that happens fairly and legally. It is not too late that the world can see a great democracy working well. Let's pray that all are safe, that God's will is done, and that we find a way that we can walk together and not walk apart. Have a great day. God bless you, and I will see you again tomorrow for Church at Home with Rachel.